Covenant Theology in brief. John Calvin believed the Scriptures mean what they say. Consequently, he was convinced true believers should read the Bible as they would read any other book. Some parts were to be understood as speaking in a figurative sense, and other parts were to be understood as speaking literally. Calvin obviously believed the Scriptures and common sense combined would identify which statements were meant to be taken as figurative and which were to be understood literally. However, John Calvin, like Martin Luther, followed the dictum literal whenever possible. It should be noted that Calvin did not get his view of how the Scriptures should be interpreted from Augustine. It's just as well. Augustine's view was more or less the same as that of Origen, the idiot, the moron who introduced the Church to the ridiculous allegorical method of interpretation. In connection with John Calvin's view of how the Scriptures are to be understood, however, one must keep in mind the fact that he was absolutely convinced unregenerate individuals could not understand the Scriptures at all. On the issue of the relationship of Israel to the Church, Calvin held to the traditional Christian view that the Church is spiritual Israel. That is, he believed the Church has inherited the same promises and the same relationship to God that Israel had in the Old Testament. According to Calvin's covenant theology, the Church is now the covenant people of God. It is, in effect, the continuation of Israel, the people of God who held the promise of God in the Old Testament. Calvin derived his belief that the Church is spiritual Israel not only from the Roman Catholic doctrine that prevailed in his own day, but also from reading the writings of Augustine. Augustine, in turn, must have gotten it from his predecessors, since it is the only view of the relationship of Israel to the Church that is ever expressed in the literature of the early Church. Consequently, we can say with some confidence that until 170 years ago, nobody in the Church had ever held a doctrine that taught anything other than the view of covenant theology and the early Church Fathers that the Church is spiritual Israel. In that regard, at least, John Calvin and all the other reformers agreed the Roman Catholic Church had never lost the truth. Concerning the Millennium, the Tribulation, the Antichrist, and the Rapture, however, Calvin is distinctly a man of his times. In spite of the fact that the early Church Fathers were clearly premillennialists, Calvin's favorite Church Father, Augustine, was an amillennialist. He was, as I told you above, responsible for the Roman Catholic Church adopting the amillennial view. Therefore, since John Calvin picked up Augustine's views, he naturally assumed Revelation 20 symbolically describes the Church as the promised kingdom of God on earth. On the basis of that belief, Calvin came to the conclusion that the Pope was the Antichrist. Hence, he contended the Church was already suffering the effects of the Great Tribulation. Not many conservative evangelicals today continue to hold Calvin's decidedly non-eschatological beliefs concerning the future of the Church. That is because the majority of evangelicals have long since abandoned Calvin's erroneous views on eschatology, realizing the need to restore additional truth about which Calvin had little to say. Consequently, Calvin's amillennial position excludes him from the premillennialists' discussion regarding the tribulation and the timing of the rapture. But it certainly doesn't exclude the early Church Fathers. They were clearly premillennialists, and they have quite a lot to say on the subject of the tribulation and the Antichrist. So before we investigate the origin and doctrines of dispensational theology, let's go back and take a look at how well Calvin's covenant theology lines up with the teaching of the early Church Fathers before Origen put his goofy spin on the truth around AD 200.